Any fresh graduate can do your job better. Preston said it the way you'd say pass the salt. Like it was obvious, like it was barely worth stating. 31 people in that conference room. I counted them later sitting in my car because my brain needed something to do with its hands. He wasn't finished. You're just an overpaid housewife playing marketer. He smiled when he said it. Not a big smile. Just a small, satisfied one, the kind that belongs on a man who's been waiting a long time to say something and is relieved to finally have it out. Go home. The kitchen's waiting. I heard somebody at the back of the room pull in a breath. Deja, 2 chairs to my left, went so still she stopped looking like a person and started looking like a photograph of one. Walt was staring at the table like it owed him something. I smiled back. I don't know where it came from, that smile. But it was there, steady and unbothered, and I let it sit on my face while I stood up, picked up my planner and walked out of my own meeting without a single word. But that's the end of this part of the story. Let me tell you how we got there. 6 weeks before that morning, I was standing at my kitchen window on Fairfield Avenue, watching the pecan tree in my backyard do absolutely nothing, which is what it does best in late September. Coffee in my chipped LSU mug. The handle's been broken since 2019 and I won't throw it away, don't ask me why. Mortgage mostly caught up. Pantry reasonably stocked. Mama calling at 7:15 the way she always does, right on schedule. That Tuesday she asked if I'd eaten breakfast. I told her yes. She said, hum, in the tone that means she doesn't believe me but has decided it's not worth the back and forth. She wasn't wrong. I'd had half a cup of coffee and a good intention. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the tail end of last night's red beans, and October was just starting to creep into the air through the cracked window, and I remember standing there thinking, this is a good morning. I'm going to have a good day. I want you to understand I completely believed that. I'd been having good mornings in that kitchen for 11 years, since I bought this house on my own income, on my own credit, with my own name on the deed. I'd earned that ordinary. And most of the time standing at that window before the day started pulling at me, it felt like exactly enough. At Crestline Medical Group I moved through my work the way you move through something you've learned by heart. Code off, dashboard up, campaign numbers before I'd even found my chair. Our patient acquisition push was running strong, click-through rates up 14% from last quarter. The billboard placement on Burt Counts pulling better than I'd projected, which gave me quiet satisfaction because I'd fought Preston for that billboard location for the better part of 6 months. 2 notes in the margin of my planner. Blue pen. Physical planner, not my phone because I think better when my hand is moving and I always have. My department was 4 people and I want you to know I'd fought for every single one of them. Deja Fontenot, my coordinator, who was sharper than half the directors in that building and deserved a promotion I'd been advocating for without result for 2 years. Walt Tran, our junior designer who drove in 40 minutes each way from Bossier City without complaint and whose work had gotten better every quarter I'd known him. A part-time analytics contractor named Greg who dialed into Mondays from what always sounded like a coffee shop and who had never once missed a deadline. I knew Deja's daughter Simone had just started kindergarten and was apparently very serious about it, already reading. I knew Walt was saving to propose and had asked me once, a little embarrassed about it, what I thought about lab-grown diamonds. I kept these details because they mattered, not because they were useful. That's the distinction I've always tried to hold on to. 12 years. A $40,000 annual budget grown to $380,000. 3 Healthcare Marketing Association awards. Every major campaign in the building had run through my hands first. That was simply true. Rochelle came by at lunch with smothered chicken in a Tupperware and an unsolicited opinion, which is her love language and always has been. She settled into the chair across from my desk, poked at her food and said what she always eventually says, "They put those awards on Preston's wall, Tam. Not yours." I gave her my standard answer. It's more complicated than that. I know what I built. The organization benefits and I'm part of the organization. Rochelle listened to all of it with her chin tilted slightly down and her eyes doing the thing they do, patient and skeptical at the same time, like she's waiting for me to hear myself. She didn't argue. She never argues. She just says the thing and leaves it on the table like something she expects you to trip over eventually. Driving back to the office, I turned the radio up. Old R&B, the station that always resets something in me. And I very nearly didn't replay her words. They put those awards on Preston's wall. Not yours. I turned the volume up one more notch. I had a 2 p.m. presentation. Thursday's staff meeting nearly didn't happen for me. I had a campaign brief due Friday and the agenda said general updates, which in 12 years of experience meant 30 minutes of information that could have been a 2-paragraph email. But I went. I always went. Preston moved through the agenda the way he moved through everything. Brisk, impersonal, not a word wasted on warmth. 8 months into his interim CEO role, he developed a new way of standing in rooms. Square, more deliberate, making slightly less eye contact than before. He was midway through when he mentioned, almost as an aside, that the board had been exploring, evolving the marketing function, and prioritizing digital native expertise going forward. The phrase had the particular smoothness of something that had been practiced. It landed and dispersed without catching on anything. I noticed he didn't look at me when he said it. I also noticed that Jace Thibodeau, 25, 3 weeks on the job, hired as a digital marketing specialist, that I had personally welcomed onto the team, was seated just inside Preston's natural sightline in a way that felt less accidental the longer I watched it. Afterward I told myself Preston valued fresh perspectives. I'd always said I did too. Friday evening I pulled up the shared drive from home to grab a file from the Women's Health Initiative folder. 6 months of my work living in that folder. The strategy, the creative briefs, the vendor negotiations, the compliance reviews. Insufficient permissions. I tried twice more. Same message. I took a screenshot, sent Kyle in IT a friendly note, kept my tone easy. System glitch, I assumed. These things happen. Monday morning. Hi Tamsin. I was told those permissions were updated per leadership direction. Let me check on this for you. He never followed up. I got busy. The week filled up the way weeks do. I almost let it go. Almost. Have you ever noticed something at work that felt wrong but talked yourself out of it, only to find out later your instincts were right the whole time? Tell me in the comments. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Kyle never did check on it. I know that now. I suspected it by Wednesday of that week, when his name stopped appearing in my inbox entirely. Not an out of office, not a follow-up, just silence where a professional courtesy should have been. I told myself he was busy. IT departments are always behind. I had a campaign brief due and a budget revision to finish and 30 other things that needed my hands on them, so I let it sit. I'm good at letting things sit when sitting still feels safer than pulling the thread. 6 weeks. That's how long I let it sit. The morning of the all-staff I wore my burgundy blazer. Structured, good fabric, the kind of piece you buy to mark an occasion. I'd bought it the year we won our first Healthcare Marketing Association award, worn it to the ceremony, hung it carefully when I got home. I don't reach for it often. But the meeting had been listed as a Q4 strategy presentation and I wanted to look like what I was. The person who built those Q4 numbers from the ground up. I got to the conference room a few minutes early, the way I always do, and took my usual seat near the window. The room filled the way it always fills. Administrators still holding their coffee, a couple of nurses in scrubs who'd clearly come straight from rounds, department heads settling in with the particular energy of people who'd rather be somewhere else. Preston stood at the front, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, shuffling papers he didn't need to shuffle. Jace Thibodeau was already seated in the second row when I arrived. He had a new laptop bag. One of those clean, structured ones that still has the shape of the box it came in. He was looking at the table. Not at his phone, not at the door, not at anything specific. Just the table, with the careful stillness of someone who has been told to act normal and is concentrating very hard on doing exactly that. I noticed. Filed it somewhere. Opened my planner. Preston opened with Q4 numbers and I felt something loosen slightly in my chest when he read them out, because they were good and I knew every variable inside them. The billboard on Burt Counts. The digital campaign that had outperformed its benchmark by 9 points. The patient acquisition numbers that had climbed 2 quarters in a row. I knew which decisions had produced each one. I knew what it had cost in late nights and renegotiated vendor contracts and one very uncomfortable conversation with a compliance officer in March. He read them without attribution. That wasn't new. I was used to that. Then he pivoted. I want to talk about the strategic restructuring of our marketing function, he said in the particular tone of a man who has practiced this sentence. The board and I have been aligned for some time on the need to invest in digital native expertise as we move into the next phase of Crestline's growth. He introduced Jace as incoming marketing director, effective immediately. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people listening, the other kind. The kind where everyone has received information simultaneously and nobody knows yet what they're allowed to do with their face. For seconds, maybe 5. Preston still hadn't looked at me. I didn't fully understand yet. That sounds impossible, I know. But there's something about being in a room full of people who all know something about you that you don't know yet. There's a lag. Your brain gets there, but it takes a beat longer than it should because it keeps bumping up against the version of reality it thought was true. I raised my hand. Not dramatically. Not to protest. I genuinely wanted to ask a procedural question. Something about transition timelines, how the handoff would work, whether there was a plan for continuity on the active campaigns. These were reasonable questions. They were the questions a professional asks. Preston turned and looked at me directly for the first time all morning. What came next had the rhythm of something rehearsed. Not read from a script. Smoother than that. The way you say something you've turned over in your mouth enough times that it comes out clean. Any fresh graduate can do your job better. You're just an overpaid housewife playing marketer. He paused. Then, go home. The kitchen's waiting. He smiled when he finished. A small smile. Settled. The smile of a man who has finally said a thing he's been holding for a while and found the saying of it satisfying. I heard someone behind me pull in a sharp breath. Deja was 2 chairs to my left and she went completely still. Not flinching still, but the deeper kind, like she'd decided if she didn't move, this moment might not be real. Walt was looking at the table. Most of the room was looking at the table. One administrator near the door was looking at me, and when I glanced at her she looked away. I smiled. I don't have a complete explanation for the smile. It wasn't a decision I made consciously. It was more like something in me assessed the situation and concluded, before I could interfere, that Preston Laird had already taken enough. He did not get my face coming apart in front of 31 of my colleagues. He did not get that. What he got was me standing up, picking up my planner and walking to my office with my head level. 8 minutes. That's how long it took to pack 12 years into a Crestline-branded tote bag. The framed photo of me and Rochelle at Jazz Fest. Her laughing at something, my head thrown back, both of us younger and not thinking about anything in particular. My LSU mug. The little succulent on my windowsill that Deja had given me for my birthday with a card that said, "Low maintenance, like you wish you were." A stack of personal notebooks I'd been keeping since 2015. The HMA award plaques were on the wall. 3 of them matted and framed. I looked at them for a moment. I left them. They had the company name on them, not mine. That had always been true. I just hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms before. I walked past Preston's office without looking in. The security guard near the lobby doors watched me come through and stepped slightly aside and didn't say anything, because nobody had told him what to do and he'd decided doing nothing was the safest choice. I pushed through the glass door and walked to my car. I sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes without starting the engine. Through the windshield, the Crestline logo on the building caught the flat November light, that particular gray-white of a Louisiana sky going into winter. I'd driven past that logo so many times it had stopped registering. Something you see every day eventually just becomes part of the background, like the pecan tree in my backyard or the chip in my coffee mug. Now it looked like signage for a place I'd never been. I started the car. Pulled out of the space evenly, signaled at the parking lot exit the way I always do and turned onto the street. I made it to the intersection at Uri Drive before the light turned red. I sat at that red light, alone, and cried. Not the pretty kind. The kind that comes from somewhere pressurized and escapes all at once, with no warning and no dignity. The kind you can only do when there's nobody there to see it. The light turned green. I drove home. I got home and changed out of the burgundy blazer and hung it back in the closet and closed the door on it. Then I sat on the edge of my bed for a while, still in my work pants, not doing anything in particular. The afternoon light came through the curtains the way it does in November. Low and thin, like it's apologizing for itself. I sat there until I realized I'd been staring at the same water stain on the baseboard for 20 minutes and hadn't thought a single complete thought. I drove to Mama's. Celestine Beecham has a recliner she's had since 2003 that she will not give up under any circumstances, including direct requests from both her daughters and one well-meaning pastor. It sits in the corner of her living room on Albemarle Street, positioned to see both the television and the front door, and when she settles into it a certain way, hands folded, chin slightly lifted, eyes aimed just past your left shoulder, you know she is preparing to receive something difficult. I told her everything. Sitting on the couch across from her, still in my work pants, talking to my own hands mostly. Preston's face when he said it. The 31 people. The tote bag. The intersection at Uri Drive. I left nothing out and I didn't cry while I was talking, which cost me something I could feel but couldn't name. When I finished, Mama was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if I wanted her to pray about it now or later. I said later and went to the bathroom. The tile floor in her bathroom is cold even in summer. Old house, no insulation under the floors, and in November it goes straight through your socks. I sat with my back against the tub and cried the way I hadn't let myself cry at the intersection. Not because I was broken exactly. More because I'd been holding the shape of a person all day and I needed somewhere private to stop doing that for a few minutes. 20 minutes. Then I washed my face, looked at myself in the mirror long enough to confirm I was still there and went back out. Mama had warmed jambalaya and set it in a bowl on the kitchen table. The TV was on low in the other room. Some evening news program, volume turned down to just sound without words. We ate. Neither of us mentioned my eyes. Outside the kitchen window it had gone dark the way November does, early and definitive, and the house felt smaller than I remembered it being when I was growing up, though I know that's not how houses work. The unemployment filing took most of the next morning. $1,847 a week. I'd looked up the Louisiana maximum before I even sat down, because I needed to know the exact number, needed to see it next to my $2,100 mortgage payment and understand exactly how far apart they were. The math wasn't catastrophic. It was just tight in the specific way that tight always is. Enough to make every small decision feel loaded, not enough to stop the baseline hum of worry. I was pulling together employment documentation when I opened my personal Gmail for a form I'd sent myself months back, and that's when I saw the folder. Work backup just in case. 847 emails. The oldest dated back to 2018. I remembered vaguely when I'd started doing it. After the server migration in 2019 wiped out a month of campaign files that IT had promised were backed up and weren't, I'd gotten into the habit of forwarding things to myself. Briefs, reports, budget documents, anything I'd put my hands on that I didn't want to lose twice. Not strategic. Just the anxious reflex of someone who'd already learned what it felt like to reach for something and find it gone. I hadn't opened that folder in years. Hadn't thought of it as anything but a precaution that had outlived its usefulness. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I closed the laptop. I wasn't ready for whatever was in there. Not yet. Rochelle started showing up without calling, which she never does. She'd appear at the door with grocery bags she'd set on the counter without commentary. A rotisserie chicken, a bag of clementines, the specific brand of yogurt I like that she'd had to remember from watching me grocery shop sometime in the past 5 years. She'd stay an hour, sometimes 2, long enough to confirm I was eating and moving and maintaining basic function. One evening she sat at my kitchen table and pulled up case law on her phone. "You could sue," she said. Not aggressive about it. Just plain. What he said in that room in front of witnesses. Tam, that's textbook. I looked it up. I told her I knew. I told her what a lawsuit actually looked like from the inside. 2, maybe 3 years, legal fees eating whatever settlement there was. And at the end of it an NDA that would seal my mouth on the subject for the rest of my professional life. "That's not normal," Rochelle said. "That's you protecting people who spent 12 years not protecting you." We almost argued. I changed the subject, asked about her kids, and she let me because she's known me long enough to know when I've made up my mind and when I'm still working through something. But the word stayed with me after she left. Protecting. I turned it over a few times, the way you turn something over looking for where it came from. Then I set it down and went to bed and didn't sleep well. The lowest point was a Wednesday. Nothing happened on that Wednesday. That was the whole problem. I drove to the Brookshires on Mansfield Road for milk, walked in and ended up standing in the cereal aisle for 9 minutes. I know it was 9 minutes because at some point I checked my phone, not to look at anything, just to do something with my hands. A woman about my age, toddler balanced on her hip, squeezed past me in the aisle and said sorry. I said it was fine. It was fine. Everything was fine. I got to my car and sat with the engine running. I wasn't thinking about the awards or the budget numbers or Preston's face or any of the things that felt like obvious things to be upset about. I was thinking about Tuesday mornings. The specific feeling of a Tuesday morning when you know exactly where you're going and your calendar is full and there are 3 things waiting on your desk and all of them are yours to handle. The ordinary weight of being needed somewhere. I missed it in a way that didn't have language. Parked in a Brookshire's lot at 11 a.m. on a Wednesday with no particular place to be, I missed it like a missing tooth. Not dramatically, just constantly, every time my mind moved in that direction and found nothing there. That night I couldn't sleep. I made it to midnight lying in the dark before I gave up, went to the couch and opened the laptop. Just looking, I told myself. I clicked the folder. 847 emails. I opened the first one. A campaign brief from March 2020, authored by me, my name in the document header, sent from my Crestline address to a vendor and forwarded to myself the same day. I opened another. A budget request from 2021, scanned and attached. My signature on the approval line in blue ink. A performance summary I'd written after our first HMA nomination, laying out the strategy and metrics that had earned it. I read for 2 hours wrapped in the blanket from the back of the couch, the house completely quiet around me, rain starting somewhere around 12:30 and tapping against the windows in an even, patient way. By 1 a.m. I'd read maybe 60 emails. The grief hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there, taking up the same space it had been taking up for 3 weeks. But something else was in there with it now. Something that didn't have a name yet but felt like the difference between a door that's locked and a door that's locked and you've just found a key. Just found it, not used it. Just held it in your hand and understood that it fit. I closed the laptop. Outside the rain kept going. When everything you worked for gets taken and credited to someone else, what do you hold on to? Tell me in the comments. And subscribe if this story is speaking to something you felt. The rain had stopped by morning. I know because I checked. Sometime around 3 a.m. I'd finally moved from the couch to the bed, and when I woke up at 6:15 the window was quiet and the street outside was just wet, reflecting the street light in long orange ribbons on the asphalt. I lay there for a minute doing the thing I'd been doing every morning for 3 weeks, waiting for the grief to land. It landed. But this morning there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Harder. Less willing to just sit. I made coffee. Got the yellow legal pad from the drawer where I keep batteries and rubber bands and things I don't want to lose. Uncapped a blue pen. Got to work. 4 days. That's how long I sat at my kitchen table working through those 847 emails. Building a record the way I'd built every campaign strategy I'd ever run. Methodically, chronologically, without letting myself skip ahead to conclusions before the data was in. I made columns. Campaign name. Date initiated. My documented role. Evidence type. Authored brief, signed budget request, performance report, award submission draft. I worked through it the way you eat something difficult. One piece at a time, not looking at the whole plate. The gaps were real and I didn't pretend otherwise. Plenty of decisions had happened in hallways in the 30 seconds before a meeting started. In phone calls I'd never thought to document because I was too busy executing what we'd just decided. That work existed only in outcomes now. In the numbers, in the campaigns that ran, in the results that had ended up on Preston's slides without attribution. I couldn't prove the hallway conversations. But what I could prove was substantial enough that by the end of day 2, the legal pad was full and I'd started a second one. By day 4, something had settled in me that I recognized from years ago. The feeling of standing in front of a finished strategy document and knowing, without needing anyone to confirm it, that the work was solid. My hands were steady on the pen for the first time in weeks. Not because the situation had changed, because I'd stopped looking at what I'd lost and started looking at what I actually had. I knew what I built. I could prove most of it. That turned out to be enough to stand on. Deja's text came on a Thursday afternoon, while I was on my second legal pad. Hey. Checking on you. 3 words. But I'd known Deja Fontenot for 6 years. And she was not a woman who reached out casually when she was sitting 20 feet from a supervisor who'd just restructured her department. That text cost her something. So I called her back. She spoke carefully, the particular measured cadence of someone conducting a conversation they're aware could be overheard. But the substance came through clearly enough. Jace had taken over the Women's Health Initiative without any transition briefing, because the briefing materials had lived in my personal folder structure, not Crestline's shared system. And nobody had thought to ask me for them before they revoked my access. He'd made 2 calls on the campaign in the first 2 weeks that Deja described, with admirable restraint, as not great. She didn't editorialize beyond that. She was telling her friend the truth, not conducting reconnaissance. "How are you doing?" she asked before we hung up. And the way she asked it, quietly like she actually wanted the answer, nearly undid me in the middle of my own kitchen. "I'm working on something," I said. "Good," she said. Like she'd been waiting to hear that. After we hung up, I added 2 lines to the legal pad: the Women's Health Initiative briefing gap and the date of Deja's call. Then I sat for a moment with the pen uncapped, looking at what I'd built across 2 full legal pads, and felt something that I can only describe as the anger finally arriving in a form I could use. Not hot and disorganized the way it had been in flashes over the past weeks. Something cooler. More directed. The kind of anger that knows exactly where it wants to go. I thought about calling Carol Broussard for 3 days before I did it. Carol ran the Louisiana chapter of the Healthcare Marketing Association. We'd met at conferences, sat on a panel together in Baton Rouge 2 years back, shared a drink in New Orleans once after a long day, and talked about the specific exhaustion of being women in rooms that kept restructuring themselves around younger people who hadn't yet learned what we already knew. She was careful and professional and perceptive, and I needed all 3 of those things from her. I called on a Thursday afternoon. Kept my voice conversational, my framing procedural. I was just curious, I said, how the HMA handled authorship in their award submission records. Standard records question. Carol listened, and when I finished there was a pause that told me she'd already understood more than I'd said. Then I mentioned simply that I had authored both of Crestline's award submissions. The 2022 and 2023 Regional Recognition Awards. I had the original drafts, the submission emails, the supporting documentation. Another pause. When Carol spoke again, her tone had shifted, still warm but formal now, in the way of someone who has just put on a professional hat and is being deliberate about it. I'd like to schedule a follow-up call, she said. I wrote the date on the legal pad and underlined it twice. Rochelle came for dinner that Saturday and I put the legal pads on the kitchen table before she arrived. When she sat down and I started walking her through it, campaign by campaign, documentation type by documentation type, the way I'd walk a client through a strategy presentation, she went quiet in a way Rochelle almost never goes quiet. She turned the pages carefully, like the paper itself was worth handling with care. Tam, she said when I finished, you've been keeping receipts for 5 years and didn't even know it. I was just backing up my files, I said. She looked at me. That's the same thing. We didn't argue that night. Not once. She stayed for dinner. I made smothered pork chops, the recipe Mama taught us both, the one that requires more patience than skill. And when she left, she stopped in the doorway and squeezed my arm firmly, the way you hold on to something you're relieved is still there. She didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. The recruiter's email arrived on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Tuesdays had always been my best working day. Director of Brand and Strategy. Baton Rouge Regional Health System. $127,000 base, full benefits, team of 6. I read it twice at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me. And I won't pretend the self-doubt didn't show up. It did, right on schedule, the voice that had spent 12 years quietly asking whether I was as good as the results suggested or just lucky enough to be in the right rooms. I knew that voice. I'd been managing it since before Preston Laird ever learned my name. I read the email a 3rd time. Then I looked at the 2 legal pads sitting at the end of the table, filled edge to edge in blue ink with 12 years of documented work, and I thought, I know exactly what I'm bringing to that job. I have it written down. I replied within the hour requesting an interview call. Then I opened a new email, addressed it to Carol Broussard, and wrote a brief, professional request for authorship correction on both HMA award submissions, with my documentation folder attached. Clear. 3 short paragraphs. I sent Carol's email first. Then I poured fresh coffee, sat back down and started preparing for the interview. 2 tracks running parallel. Preston had no idea either one existed. The interview was on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after I'd sent Carol's email. I drove to Baton Rouge in the dark, left Shreveport at 5:45 a.m. to beat the traffic on I-20, and spent most of the drive running through answers to questions I'd prepared the night before. Not because I was nervous exactly. More because preparation is how I'm built. I don't walk into rooms unprepared, not for campaigns, not for board presentations, not for conversations that matter. By the time I pulled into the parking garage downtown, I knew what I was going to say and why I was going to say it. The 2 legal pads were in my bag. I didn't need to look at them. I just needed to know they were there. The interview went well. I'll leave it at that. Preston's first voicemail arrived 11 days after I'd left. I know the exact count because I'd been tracking, not obsessively, just the way you track a weather system that's moving in your direction. I was making red beans, the long way from dried, which requires attention at the start and then mostly just patience, when my phone buzzed on the counter and his name came up on the screen. I turned the burner down to low. Picked up the phone. Let it ring through to voicemail. Then I stood at the stove and listened. His voice had a particular texture I recognized from years of watching him manage situations he hadn't anticipated. Smooth on the surface. Slightly too controlled underneath. He started with "Tamsin, it's Preston," as though I wouldn't know, and then said "Brittany's" before correcting himself to Jace. He'd recorded this once. Hadn't bothered to do it again. The slip was small and said everything. He'd made this call quickly without thinking it through, which meant the situation was already more urgent on his end than he wanted me to know. There were some client communication nuances, he said. Jace was working through them. He thought a brief transitional consultation, purely professional, might be mutually beneficial. Mutually beneficial. I set the phone back on the counter. Gave the beans a stir. Saved the voicemail before I put the phone down, not because I had a plan for it, just because I've learned not to delete things I might need later. Then I finished making dinner. The HMA process moved the way institutional processes always do, steadily without drama on its own timeline. Carol's office sent a formal letter to Crestline requesting confirmation or contest of authorship records on 2 award submissions. I wasn't in the room when that letter arrived. I didn't need to be. I'd done what I could do, provided what I had, answered every follow-up question from Carol's office the same way I'd answer a client brief, completely without editorializing, letting the documentation do the talking. They contacted me twice more for supporting materials. Both times I sent exactly what they asked for, nothing extra, nothing performative. My name went back onto the records. Award submission author, Tamsin Beecham. 2 lines in a professional database that most people in the world would never see, and that meant, to me, more than I have the words to properly explain. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't a public shaming. It wasn't Preston standing in front of 31 people having to take back what he said. It was just the truth corrected in a place where truth is supposed to live. That was all I'd asked for. Turned out to be enough. Deja called on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the HMA letter had gone out. I could tell from the first syllable that she'd been sitting on something. Her voice had that particular compressed energy of a person who has been careful for too long and is finally in a place where they can stop. He told me about Gerald Arsenault. Gerald was a board member I'd met twice in 12 years, brief formal encounters at company events where I'd been present in my capacity as the person who'd built the marketing program that made the company look good. His wife, Deja informed me, had run her own accounting firm for 22 years before selling it. 3 of the other board members also had wives who'd built careers. When the HMA letter arrived and someone connected it to what Preston had said in the all-staff meeting, in front of 31 witnesses, some of whom apparently had very good memories, Gerald Arsenault had questions. Specific ones. The board meeting where Preston answered them was described to Deja, by someone who'd been in the building at the time, as not comfortable. Preston kept his job. Of course he did. He had relationships and history and the particular job security of a man who'd made himself difficult to remove. I'd known that going in. I hadn't been trying to take his job. I'd been trying to take back something that belonged to me, and those are entirely different objectives. But Deja said something had shifted in that boardroom. The way people looked at him. The particular quality of the silence when he spoke now. Shifts like that compound over time. They don't unshift. I just thought you should know, Deja said. Thank you, I told her. And I meant it in the full sense, not just for the information but for all of it. For going still in that conference room. For the text that said hey. For being someone who told her friend the truth when it cost something to do it. About Jace. I've thought about him more than people might expect. He wasn't a villain. He was 25 and someone had handed him a role whose actual complexity nobody had briefed him on, possibly because the person who understood it best had just been publicly humiliated out the door. His instincts around content, short-form video, organic engagement, digital storytelling were genuinely good. I could see that from the outside. But healthcare marketing isn't content creation with a logo swap. There's HIPAA. There's FDA guidance on clinical language. There's patient privacy embedded in every testimonial decision. A compliance officer flagged a post within 48 hours of it going up. A patient story, well-intentioned, that included details the patient hadn't formally cleared. It came down fast and never became public. But the internal conversation that followed made clear that Jace needed infrastructure around him, guardrails and institutional knowledge that nobody had thought to build before installing him in the role. That knowledge had walked out the door carrying a Crestline-branded tote bag. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because it's true and because the difference between what I felt then and what I'd felt 6 weeks earlier was the difference between a wound and a fact. Facts you can just acknowledge. They don't require anything from you emotionally. The offer came on a Friday afternoon in December. $127,000. Full benefits. A team of 6. Director of Brand and Strategy, Baton Rouge Regional Health System, start date of my choosing. I accepted the same day. I called Mama first, who said, "Thank you, Jesus," before she said anything to me, which is her highest form of praise. Then Rochelle, who made a sound I can only describe as deeply satisfied, and said she was coming over. I told her not to bring anything. She brought wine anyway. After the calls, I went out to the back porch. December in Shreveport is cold enough to mean it but not cold enough to be cruel, and the pecan tree stood bare against the late afternoon sky, every branch visible now that the leaves were gone, the whole architecture of it exposed and holding steady. Preston had left 3 voicemails total. The most recent one 2 days earlier had dropped all the professional framing. His voice was different in that one, stripped of the smoothness, working harder than it usually did. He'd said something about clearing the air. About how he hoped there were no hard feelings. I'd listened to it once. Saved nothing. My name was on the HMA records. My name was on a job offer letter sitting on my kitchen table. My name was written in blue ink across 2 full legal pads documenting 12 years of work that had always been mine. He could keep the voicemails. I had everything I needed. She never raised her voice, never filed a lawsuit, never made a scene, just put her name back where it belonged. Was that enough justice, or would you have done more? Subscribe and tell me below. Rochelle stayed until almost 11 that December night, and when she finally left she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at me the way she sometimes does. Like she's taking an inventory, confirming all the pieces are still where they belong. "You good?" she asked. "Getting there," I said. She nodded. Took that as sufficient. Rochelle has always understood that getting there for me means more than fine for most people, and she's never pushed for more than I have to give. She drove home and I locked the door and stood in my kitchen for a few minutes in the quiet, looking at the job offer letter still on the table and thought, 3 months. 3 months and everything will look different. I was right. I just didn't know yet how different it would actually feel. I started at Baton Rouge Regional Health System on a Monday in early March, when Louisiana had shaken off the last of the gray and the air through the car window smelled like cut grass and something blooming I couldn't identify. My new office was on the 3rd floor of the recently renovated East Wing, smaller than my old one, with a window that looked out over the hospital's green space and a faint smell of fresh paint that would take another month to fully clear. I didn't mind it. There's something about walking into a space that's still becoming itself. My new team was 6 people who watched me the first morning with the careful neutrality of employees who've been through enough leadership transitions to know better than to invest too quickly. I didn't push. I just learned names. All 6, first day, no cheat sheet, and paid attention to what each person reached for when they were figuring something out. By day 3 I knew that Marcus, my senior strategist, needed 10 minutes of independent processing before he'd share a half-formed idea, and that my coordinator Patricia was the kind of person who'd already thought 3 steps past the problem by the time she raised her hand. On day 3, Patricia also mentioned, almost in passing, that her daughter was finishing her marketing degree at Grambling in the spring. I wrote it in my planner. Blue pen inside cover where I keep the things that matter. Some habits are just how you're made. The commute was the part of this I hadn't fully reckoned with. The drive itself was manageable. An hour and 40 minutes on a clear day, mostly I-20 to I-49, a stretch of Louisiana highway that moves through pine forest and small towns and opens up flat and wide as you close in on Baton Rouge. I listened to podcast. I found a morning radio program out of Baton Rouge that made me laugh on the bad days. The drive itself was fine. It was Sunday evenings that took adjustment. There's a specific quality to the silence of a house you're about to leave for 5 days. I'd pack my bag. The same rolling carry-on every week, same placement of things, efficiency by habit. And the house on Fairfield Avenue would get quiet around me in a way that was nobody's fault and still required something of me to sit inside. I was 44 years old and I'd lived alone for a long time, and I thought I understood my own relationship with solitude. Sunday evenings taught me I'd only understood the weekend version of it. I started calling Mama from the road. Not 12 minutes anymore. 20, sometimes 25, because the drive was longer and she was willing and I had more to say than I used to. She'd pray sometimes, just a few sentences, natural and quiet in the middle of conversation, and I stopped doing the thing where I let it wash past me without landing. I let it land. It didn't fix anything. It helped. Rochelle started meeting me at the house on Fridays. I'd pull into the driveway after the long drive back and she'd already be inside. She had a key, had always had a key, and there'd be a beer on the counter for me and whatever she was eating at the kitchen table. She never announced it. Never made it a thing. She just showed up week after week, and that was its own language between us, the one we've been speaking our whole lives without needing to name it. The maternal health campaign launched in June. 16 weeks of strategy and community partnership and careful compliance review, and the kind of granular attention to underserved zip codes that requires you to actually go to those neighborhoods and listen before you ever write a brief. I led every piece of it. My name was the first name on every document, every external communication, every vendor contract. When I submitted it for an HMA regional award, I sat at my desk for a moment before I hit send. Not hesitating, just present. Acknowledging the weight of what it meant to have my name be the first and only name in the author field by design from the beginning, not as a correction after the fact. The confirmation email came back within an hour. I read it 3 times. Then I printed it and added it to the folder I'd started on my first week. Not an anxiety folder, not a backup, not a just in case. A record. Built forward deliberately by someone who had learned the difference between working hard and working visibly. Patricia knocked on my door while I was still looking at the printout. "You need anything before I head out?" she asked. "No," I said. "Have a good evening." After she left, I sat quietly for a moment in my office, listening to the particular late afternoon sounds of a hospital floor winding down. Then I filed the confirmation and got back to work. Preston called in April. 4th voicemail, and the last one I'd ever received from him. I was at a Walgreens drive-thru on a Friday evening, home for the weekend, fighting a mild cold that had followed me down from Baton Rouge like an afterthought. I had cold medicine in a bag on the passenger seat, and the receipt was still printing when his name appeared on my phone. I listened while the receipt printed. He said he'd heard I was doing well. He said he thought there'd been some miscommunication around my departure. He said he hoped I'd consider grabbing coffee sometime, clearing the air, no pressure. Miscommunication. I held the word in my mind for a moment, turning it over the way you'd turn over a rock to see what's underneath. Then I put my phone in my bag, took my cold medicine and drove home. Made soup. Watched something on television I couldn't tell you about now. Went to bed at a reasonable hour. I didn't delete the voicemail. Didn't save it. Just let it sit until it disappeared on its own, which is what things do when you stop giving them your attention. The shadow box went up in July. I'd ordered it in June. Plain black frame, clean matte, nothing decorative, and had the 2 HMA certificates from my Crestline years reissued with corrected authorship attribution. The originals had the company name. He's had mine. I hung it on the wall directly behind my desk level so that anyone who sat across from me in a meeting could see it without me having to say a word about it. My team walked past it every day. Nobody asked. I didn't explain. It was simply there, the way things are there when they belong somewhere. That evening I drove home to Shreveport in the long July light. Windows cracked, a playlist Rochelle had made me playing low, the kind of drive where the sun stays up so late you lose track of time and just move through the light. I pulled onto Fairfield Avenue just before 8, and the pecan tree was full out the way it gets in July. That deep, saturated green that means the whole summer is still ahead, everything's still growing. I got out of the car and stood under it for a minute. Just stood there in the shade of it, with the warm evening air and the sound of a neighbor's sprinkler somewhere down the block and the particular quality of a Friday that belongs entirely to you. I wasn't the same woman who had stood in a conference room in November in a burgundy blazer, keeping her face still while 31 people went quiet. That woman had been holding so much competence and patience and 12 years of work that had no paper trail because she'd been too busy doing the work to document it for herself. She'd been sustaining a structure that didn't acknowledge her. She'd been protecting people who hadn't thought twice about what that cost her. This woman had her name on the records. On the offer letter. On the campaign brief. On the wall. I went inside. Made dinner. Called Mama. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. The commute was still long. Some Sundays were still harder than they should have been. The mortgage didn't care about any of it. Life continued the way life does, indifferent to the size of what you've been through. But I was building something that was mine from the first brick, and I knew how to prove it, and I was nowhere near finished. That was more than enough. She rebuilt quietly with her name on everything from the start. Subscribe to this channel, share this story with a woman who needs it, and tell me, what would you have done differently?